Thank you. I would also, well, I'm not, in what my few words I'm going to say at the start, going to look at editorial policy and leader writing, but I'm very happy to talk about how newspapers get to their policy stances during the discussion at the end. I'll talk for a little bit, and if you get bored, do intervene and ask me questions, and don't wait till the end. But so I'll talk for a brief period of time, and then we can open it out and have a discussion. A few years ago, I addressed some Liberal Democrats about the challenges of getting their message across to the media. During questions, one man complained vociferously about the lack of what he saw as fair coverage in the national press and television of his party. I asked him what he'd done about it, and I got the largest round of applause in the evening after he had said he'd done nothing. And I then told him he should get off his backside and do something rather than sit there moaning. So I think there is a very good starting point here. If you're complaining about something and you're not happy about something, ask yourself what you did about it, and then ask what you can do about it now. Now, of course, this man wasn't unique. When it comes to looking at media coverage of your activities, I've yet to meet anyone who believes they've got really fair and accurate coverage. And that applies to companies, political parties, individuals, countries. And most, as I say, are happy to complain rather than do anything. Some of you who have attended other talks in this series will know that there are things you can do to put your case across, either yourself, through your PR people, or most desperately, expensively and wastefully through your lawyers. I hope I can supplement this by giving you some idea of how journalists respond to the way you present yourselves, and give you some idea of what works and what doesn't. There are many cases where complaints about what newspapers and broadcasters do are justified. The media does get things wrong, and they're not always the best at making fair corrections. Proprietors, editors have their agendas, as do broadcasters, though sometimes they like to pretend they're neutral. And these can swing, and their views can swing from an excess of sycophancy to an extreme of hostility, sometimes on the same person within a few months. And we've seen recently in what's been going on in the stories about phone tapping by the News of the World, just that some of the practices either are not what many people would regard as acceptable. Sometimes it's also true that the coverage can be the servants of the opinion of the newspapers. And of course it's inevitable that the organisations who are better at getting their message across receive a much more sympathetic press than those who do not. And that's a fact of life. You have to live with that and do something about it. Actually, the usual complaint I get is sort of summed up in this comment about what senior executives will say about the way they're reported. They will say to me, I don't mind what people say about me or my organisation as long as it's accurate. I'm afraid they're deluding themselves in that, and this is total nonsense. Actually, accuracy is the last thing people are worried about. Very few care whether they're reported precisely and accurately. What they're really concerned about is whether they're reported favourably. Just look at the combinations of accuracy and favourable reporting. An accurate and favourable article goes down well, but no one has ever really complained about an inaccurate article that is favourable. I've never had the chief executive of a company saying, who I've written a nice article about, he's never rang me up and said, you've written nice things about me, actually my company's on the verge of bankruptcy. Don't do that. And executives don't really mind an unfavourable article that's inaccurate because it allows them to take the moral high ground. No, the times I've really had abuse from people is when I've written something that's both accurate and critical. At that point, the press officer is shouted at by his chief executive and a letter of complaint sent to the editor. A further complication for reporters is that news managers lie or tell half-truths and give misleading briefings and then complain that the story is inaccurate. Particularly in the political world, there is a lot of spinning, a lot of dodging. So, sometimes people get that wrong when they write the stories. Sometimes too, spin doctors float ideas unattributably, and then they scorn the concept when it's turned out to be unpopular. And of course there are the film stars who tell the press that they will be in certain places to be photographed and then complain about an invasion of privacy. So this can be a murky world. And the reality is that at some stage or other, you'll come into contact with the media and its machinations. Not a lot of people like the idea, or indeed the media they come into contact with. Indeed, it's very hard to find someone who says anything positive about my trade. One critic noted that everything you read in newspapers is absolutely true, except that rare story of which you have first-hand knowledge. Former American President Thomas Jefferson said the man who reads nothing at all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers. And another former American President, Lyndon Johnson, noted with his characteristic sharpness the fact that a man is a newspaper reporter is evidence of some flaw in character. So we know where we are. Because you'll have to deal with them, however unpleasant they may be. And this means identifying what journalists want and what they don't want. And it doesn't mean identifying what you think journalists should want. And that's a totally different discussion. But I think for this purposes, what we're looking at, it's a matter of how you either get people to write positively about you, or how you minimize when they are writing hostile things about you. So you want to minimize damage and maximize your opportunities. Unfortunately, the people advising you on how to do this don't always give you the best advice. Public relations companies, there are, of course, a number of excellent public relations companies with guys who are very well informed and give very good service, but frankly, too many don't give enough service for the jaw-dropping amounts of money they charge. And I mentioned press releases earlier, and I've written in my notes that too often sending out press releases is regarded as the start and finish of public relations. And there is now, of course, the all-purpose excuse for the lazy press officer to tell the lazy journalist to look at our company's website. If you are going to do a press release, there's no point. You have to think about what the journalist is likely to want to read, not what he should want, what he should say. So it's not a matter of you selling the story you want. You must say, put yourself in the position of the person who's going to be receiving it, and make it easy for them as well. If you're going to have a lot of the press releases you'll do will be a response to a certain development. So you make certain that you sent out a comment on something. You do the basics right. You spell it right. You make certain it's accurate. You get the name of the person being quoted spelled correctly, and you get their title right. If you do all that, and the guy doesn't have to check up on them, then you've got a much more chance of getting in. I mean, it's basic common sense. So how should you judge if your PR service is dealing properly with journalists? Firstly, don't be sucked into measuring success by the number of column inches, as some less than intelligent finance directors are prone to do. Often the most successful PR actions involve stopping stories altogether or altering the tone of them by the personal relationship that the PR man has with the journalist, or the relationship that he's enabled you as his client to build with the journalist. And I've always believed that the best way to do this is to get to know journalists to the point when you don't actually need to talk to them. If you ring up and say, "Help, I've got a crisis, I want to talk to you about this, that and the other," and the guy's never met you or talked to you, he's not going to be as sympathetic as if he's already known you before. It's a plain truth that most journalists are human. They find it harder to be critical of people they have a relationship with, just like everyone else does. So if you build up a relationship that will enable you to ring up when you really want to get a point over, and because the reporter knows you, he's much more likely to trust you or do you a favour. Human nature. And it also means that when I want a quote for an article I'm writing, I'm more likely to go to someone I know and give good coverage. And if I know that person can anticipate the sorts of things I want to hear, that's fine. And if you listen carefully to the way the question is asked, then you can do that. This doesn't mean, of course, that you can change the style or content of a newspaper or television programme. You can't make the Telegraph into a socialist paper or the Mirror into a Tory one. But you've only to look at the charm offensive mounted by Tony Blair in the 1990s to get the support of the Murdoch papers in the run-up to the 1997 election and afterwards to see that it's possible to change attitudes. that, of course, was a graphic turnaround, and dealing with Murdoch can be a difficult relationship because he's just likely to junk you at a certain point. So a relationship is with Murdoch is always fleeting and certainly never forever. It's rather like that old Battersea Dogs Home slogan: "A dog is for life, not just for Christmas." A relationship with Murdoch is certainly not for life, and you're just grateful if it gets as far as Christmas. It's always worth making your case. I remember when Peter Mandelson was a spin doctor for the Labour Party before he became an MP. He would always ring. I was a political correspondent at the Telegraph, and he would always ring, and other papers right of centre, just to ensure that his new view was known. And of course, Alistair Campbell was exceptionally good at bullying journalists of all shapes and sizes. In essence, then I need as press spokesman either to arrange an interview with a senior corporate figure or to give an informed briefing on behalf of those figures. And all too often those things don't happen. But if you remember that that's what you're trying to do when you're trying to get a message across, that will make a great help. The other problem I find as a journalist is when I meet someone and they are on duty, in inverted commas, I often find they've been media trained into incoherent inertia. They regard an interview as a success if they've evaded every question. And sometimes I think that corporate and financial leaders are being so media managed that they actually damage the institutions they think they're promoting. It's very useful for you to learn about TV studios and how you may be interviewed by the press and the tricks that they'll use, and media trainers are fine for that. But both reporters and, I think, the public are wise to the evasive content. You hear it on the radio every day when you get someone who starts off, what is important when you ask the question about something else, and may I first say, and such, all these other evasive combination of words. And I think now if you get media trainers who tell you to do that, you should shoot them, or fire them anyway. Too often the interviewee seems satisfied if he or she has avoided a tricky question, rather than looking at the overall impact of an interview. Yesterday, for example, I don't know if anyone else heard this, it was on one of the news programmes, someone called Carol Otway, who was head of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board. She was being asked about compensation for people who had been injured, and she was absolutely technically precise, used all the right media tricks, and no doubt was totally happy with what she'd done. But listening at the other end, she came across as totally cold, totally heartless. So again, media training must be your servant, and if you don't think about the message you're trying to get across, you can sometimes damage your own presentation. I remember I was doing some interviewing in the Middle East of some banks, and I went along to see the people who were running HSBC in Dubai, and I knew a reasonable amount about the subjects we were talking about, and it was quite clear that the answers they gave were totally inadequate. And when I came to doing some media at some banking awards later in the year, I didn't give it to them, not because it was quite clear they weren't actually giving an understanding of what their bank was doing and up to. They were just trying to get away with the minimum. So you can actually do yourself some collateral damage if you don't sort of see every opportunity and don't see how you can exploit it. Some of you may even be tempted to reach for your lawyers to use tagging lists, libel laws, or privacy legislation. Not for me to discuss the morality of these actions here. That's for another time, or we'll do that later if you're interested in doing it. I think the most interesting one at the moment is the one which is happening, which is being used by wealthy people, and lawyers have been very keen to push it. No doubt they've lost so much business from the corporate side, they've got to find new areas, and privacy legislation is a very lucrative business for them, particularly as most of their clients are likely to be extremely wealthy footballers or other people involved in the media. And the privacy legislation has been used by a variety of people to stop stories about paternity, girlfriends and peccadillos. And it's relatively new, everyone's finding their way with this legislation. All I would say is, well, it appears to work as a short-term measure. I have serious doubts whether it really stops stories from eventually leaking out. The international web is just so vast now, and these stories do tend to eventually come out. And another thing is that you actually irritate the newspaper editors so much by doing it that they will look for other means of attacking you. Again, not making a moral judgment here whether this is ethical behaviour by newspaper editors. This is the reality of what happens. And obviously, when the truth does come out, as John Terry of Chelsea Football found, the coverage tends to be somewhat less than sympathetic. Actually, might have been much better use of his money to hire someone like Max Clifford, who would have spun the story for him, sold it to the newspaper, and he'd come out quite well out of it. But Max Clifford, expensive though he is a lot cheaper than a lawyer. Finally, in some ways, this is interesting for bigger corporations, and this has an interesting element of political debate. It's media lobbying. One can actually go through all kinds of corporate media lobbying, and I just really wanted to look at one particular example, which I think in its banality actually illustrates the extent to what some people are prepared to do. Now, it is sometimes tempting to get involved and to discuss the Arab-Israeli the way in which the different groups present themselves, but that tends to be so emotive. I've decided not to do that in this particular instance, although again I'm very happy to go into it later, because I think it gets too emotional and you lose track of the precise lessons that you need to learn. I'm going for something which is almost as sensitive, but not quite. It's the way in which Greece and Turkey have presented themselves. And I have to say that I'm looking at a particular, very small instance, but I think it does illustrate how to do it and how not to do it. I think it goes without saying that Greece has managed to get much better coverage of itself, and leaving aside the latest economic crash, but in terms of regional politics, than Turkey has. I've spent quite a few anguished hours with Turkish politicians who have been asking why this happens. And it's not so much the generous hospitality offered by the Greek and Greek Cypriot governments and their lobbying groups. I think now actually most governments do that to a greater or lesser extent, although the Greeks were actually some of the first inviting large numbers of British MPs out to enjoy the pleasures of beaches of Cyprus. More interesting for me is the way editors and politicians can be pressurized when there has been what the Greek government would define as unsympathetic coverage. Now, this is something that I was involved in a couple of years ago, probably a bit longer now, maybe almost a decade ago, but I think the point still stands. I was working then for a newspaper called The European, which was a pan-European newspaper, and looked at the European Union, also wider Europe, and it was a very interesting time to be doing that in the last decade of the last century. Now, it's a very banal story, but it illustrates the point. The editor of The European decided to put a weather map in the paper. You might think that wasn't a controversial thing to do, but within days, the postbag was overflowing with letters complaining that two very small islands appeared on the map as part of Turkey rather than Greece. The letters came from all over the world, were virtually identical, and nearly all the writers' names ended in opus. These writers also complained that one of the states created when Yugoslavia was broken up was identified on the map as Macedonia. Greece and its lobbyists were in the middle of a campaign then to have the country renamed as the Federal Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Then what happened to the European was a small skirmish in this PR war. My editor bowed to the pressure to make the changes which the Greeks demanded. There were only polite complaints from the Turkish and Macedonian embassies, so the changes remained. So, a little spat over a map left a very clear message to my editor that nothing was too small for the Greek lobby to worry about. And from then on, all stories about Greece and Cyprus were treated with extra care. So this is, I think it's very interesting that if you just nothing, you will lose out, because there are some people who are much more aggressive and much more determined to do so. So what would I say in conclusion? You may not like the media, you may not think we're fair, but if you think of what journalists need, you can ensure that your company or the country can protect its interests better. And the next time you see something on television or on the radio that you dislike, I hope you won't phone a friend who condemned the coverage. I hope instead that you'll ask yourself what you can do about the coverage and then take action. So my message to you is in dealing with media, don't leave it to others. Now, I'm happy to take questions or discussions.